Hello, Fiona here. So I'm going to be talking about creating a lesson plan for the age group of third grade to teach them about ellipses and talk about the differences between ellipses and circles. Um, and I had a little bit of trouble with creating this lesson plan because there's a lot of details in ellipses and the equations for an ellipse and on graphs that they wouldn't have actually gotten to at that point, especially with working with an x and a y axis. If they had done that at that point in third grade, they certainly wouldn't have done a lot of work with it, and so it would be a task in itself just to find a point on the graph. Um, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about like the differences between a circle and and an ellipse. So I broke down the lesson plan into a few parts, starting with a group discussion, a instructional piece, an independent work with some like more personal assistance with different people so I can touch base with individuals. Um, and then coming back together as a group to talk about what we noticed or what we learned from doing the activity in the independent work. So the group discussion, first we kind of talk about what do you already know. And of course we're going to talk about what do they know already about circles. And I wanted to also relate to what they know about the difference between squares and rectangles because I feel like it's a very good connection for them to have between circles and ellipses. It's very similar to squares and rectangles. And go over some key words that we have like radius and what we know about a graph. Because we're going to be using a worksheet with graph paper on it. Not the whole thing being a piece of graph paper, but with like instructions and a section where they are supposed to be drawing ellipses on a graph. So I'll talk about that in a second though. So for the group discussion, I would really want to have their input and be writing this all on a whiteboard for them to be able to have as like some of their information, their I guess I'd say like a little cheat sheet for them to help them when they're doing their independent work to look up at the board and say, well, we do know this about, circles. So what I would really be looking for with that conversation for them to bring up, if they didn't bring it up, I would bring these things up and talk about them, is the relationship between squares and squares and rectangles, noticing that a square has, the same sides. If you draw a circle, you can put it in a square with four sides touching and have it still be a circle. But with a rectangle, if you had a square or a circle in the middle, that it wouldn't have all four sides touching. It would just have two or maybe three depending on where the circle is on the rectangle. But because one of the rectangles might have, or one edge of the rectangles would have a different size. I'd be drawing this on the board instead of explaining it so it would look a little bit better, but I would basically be talking about how those things are connected and what we know about circles, and talking about one of our keywords of radius. And the radius is going to be one of their bigger words for this lesson that they should have talked about in a lesson previously with circles, that we'll talk about some more with ellipses, because obviously it's very important for them to see the relationship of the radius in terms of the ellipse, because that's going to be one of their big things that's different between the circles and the ellipses. So we'll go through basically how the graphs work, and the importance of plotting things correctly, because when they do the next activity, that's going to be very important. Since they don't have a lot of experience with a graph, with like graph paper, we'll have to go into more detailed instruction of that. So next, we would talk about basically what they're going to be doing. What I would be giving them to work on is a worksheet that hypothetically would have a question like, um, if you have a um, if you have an ellipse that is on the x-axis from like -10 to +10, and then on the y-axis from -5 to +5, what would that look like, and having them draw it. And we've been talking a lot about like the equations and everything that is involved with that, but from my experience in the classroom, I can see that in itself being a relatively challenging activity for them. So I would kind of focus on, when doing the activity, having them have the ability to place each of the points in the right spot. I'm not sure. I want to say that we could branch out and have it be so that they are able to make 4 points on a graph and then make the ellipse from that. But I'm not sure I could stray too far away from the x and y axes for those, because I'm not sure they'd be able to move it around outside of it, like finding, like different points that are like 2, 2 or 2, 3 on a graph. But I guess I would judge it based on how well they had worked with circles in a similar assignment, or how comfortable they were with graphs. And for some of the kids, I might change it up so that they are doing that activity. With other kids, I might, be focusing a little bit more on if they are having trouble with circles in themselves, I might have to give them, or with shapes and graphs themselves, they might have to give them kind of a modified assignment where they're kind of, instead of having the focus of it being recognizing the way that the ellipse is made, just recognizing the really most basic differences between a circle and an ellipse, and being able to kind of recognize them. So while they're working on that worksheet, I would kind of walk around, check in with other students, see how they're doing with their assignment, and asking about what they're noticing, kind of guiding them in the right direction for most of these questions to help them out. And then the most important part is when we come back together, the what I noticed part of the assignment or the lesson. Having us come back together as a big group, or as a big group, and working again on what we learned about ellipses, or what else we noticed about ellipses. For this, even though we had already talked about radius as a word earlier in the lesson, I would want one of the students to bring up that the radius of an ellipse was not always the same all the way around the sides. And they could say that in a way that's as simple as saying the distance from the sides of the circle were different, like to the middle of the circle, or the middle of the ellipse, than it is on a circle where it's the same all the way around. So those are my main things I'd be looking for them to get out of it. I would love to have some of the students get a little bit more in depth and notice that they can move it around on the graph and it's still an ellipse, but I don't think that we'd be able to really get into as much of the equation as that. So I guess I kind of struggled with the age group being at a point where you can't really get into as much detail because they really haven't had the experience yet. But I guess it really depends on the class that you have and what they have had for experience. but I would like to hear them use their keywords like radius, talk about if they want the diameter, if we've talked about the word diameter before, and talk about what it was like using the graph and how they found those points, and just demonstrate a new, like a better proficiency with using a graph. So that would be my main lesson plan. I would love to incorporate a game at the end of it. I always think that that's fun to keep them engaged in the subject. I had trouble thinking of a game for ellipses specifically, but I was thinking that I could do something related to shapes, and after this lesson be able to incorporate ellipses into that lesson, or that game afterwards. So that's my lesson. All right. Thank you.